This video is a hypothetical scenario of how I think World War III could break out and come to fruition. I'm by no means claiming that this is some sort of prophecy that will definitely happen, except for the fact that I'm actually a gigabrain AI pretending to be a human that secretly is telling you how the future will play out. 100% of what I'm about to say will happen according to the percent of which I'm absolutely certain, which is 0%. Cheers, and let the bloodiest war in human history not begin. Let's break down the scenario geographically, since this is a world war after all. We will start off with Europe and Russia, take a brief look at the Arctic, and then move on to the Middle East and then the Indian subcontinent, and finally to the Asia-Pacific region. I will also be glossing over Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, not because I don't think they're interesting, but probably because they won't play a significant role if there is to be a war. But who knows, maybe Jamaica and the Caribbean will enact plans for world domination.
Bombakat!
And I will also look into elements of the World War that won't be on the world, namely through the digital and space theaters, because if I don't, people on Reddit might get mad. First, let's set up the scene. We currently live in a Pax Americana, a world in which the United States is the world's sole superpower. The US is the largest economy and has the most powerful military. It's also at the cutting edge of science and technology and is the foremost cultural exporter on the planet. However, there are numerous contenders, namely the European Union, which is a supranational organization and for the most part is aligned with the US. The EU is not a nation again, but rather a supranational organization composed of various nation-states that have abandoned their old ways of slaughtering each other ad nauseum for just chilling together and getting rich. The two main players in this supranational union are France, the only nuclear weapons-armed country in the Union, as well as Germany, its largest economy. With the EU, there are certainly differences in geopolitical outlook. France wants to exert its own autonomy. Germany wants to keep the economy centered around itself, and many Eastern European nations are more paranoid about Russia than virtually anybody else. Now, most EU countries are members of NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which includes most of EU countries, excluding some like Austria and Ireland. On the other hand, there are some countries like Norway and Turkey and the UK which are members of NATO but not members of the EU. Now, Article 5 of NATO states that an attack on one nation is an attack on all, prompting collective self-defense, primarily in regards to Russia. It's also worth mentioning that the UK, a former member of the EU, has very close ties to both the EU and the United States. The UK has a close relationship with the EU despite ditching it, however it also maintains a close tie with the United States as well as many of its Commonwealth daughter countries like Canada, Australia, and some of the others. If there were to be a World War III, then the UK would side with the EU and the US. Now, let's move on to another major player, the big elephant in the room as far as Europe is concerned, and that is the Russian Federation, which is an autocracy with very poor relations with both the United States and the European Union. It is the largest country by landmass and was once thought of having the most powerful military on the planet after the United States, but its track record during the invasion of Ukraine has made many think otherwise. Its economy at this point is essentially a petrostate, primarily based upon natural gas exports and oil. It has lost most of its former allies to NATO over the years, and most of its vassal states are fairly insignificant, like, sorry Tajikistan, no one is afraid of you. Now, to the east of Russia, and Tajikistan for that matter, lies China. China is the second largest economy in the world, and the second largest nation in population after India. Like Russia, it is an autocracy, and the two are fairly aligned yet not concrete allies, at least not yet. Now, putting the Eurasian landmass in the realm of one potential alliance, the brown bear and the panda bear, is still something that is yet to be foretold. China is the largest trading partner on the planet, the factory of the world, and a leader in information technology, as well as the largest military by manpower. It also has been engaged in the Belt and Road Initiative, which forges numerous economic ties on the Eurasian landmass, excluding India and Japan, and we'll get to that later. It also has strong ties with numerous African and Latin American nations. But whether or not these economic ties will transition into political or military alliances is somewhat questionable. If World War III were to break out, I doubt the US would fear Nicaragua joining the Chinese alliance. Back to Asia, South Korea is one of the US's closest allies in the Pacific, known for its powerful economy and massive cultural and technological output. It is also known for its rivalry with China's ally North Korea, which has none of those powers, but it does have nukes and a leader who supposedly doesn't take shits. Then comes Japan. Now, Japan is a great power, but it's also one that is in a state of stagnation. One of the largest economies in the world, the third at the point of the making of this video, but due to a demographic crisis among other factors is lagging behind. Regardless of this, it is still a great power with a massive economy, great cultural influence, and is arguably the most technologically advanced nation on the planet. It is largely aligned with the United States and holds very negative relations with China. China's allies in its own backyard are North Korea, Burma, also known as Myanmar, and Cambodia. These are rather weak when compared to the US's major Pacific allies like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia. The two wildcards in this region would be Vietnam and Indonesia, which we'll discuss later on. Now, one of the People's Republics of China's primary political interests is in, you guessed it, Taiwan, also known as the Republic of China, which, unlike China, or the People's Republic of China, is actually a republic, rather than an authoritarian one-party state. Are the terms confusing? Yes, they are. So I'm just going to call them China and Taiwan. Now, the reason for this conundrum is that during World War II, China was invaded by Japan, which prompted the Chinese nationalists and Chinese communists to unite and kick them out. Once the Japanese were gone, the two factions fought each other, the nationalists with the US backing and the communists with Soviet backing. The communists eventually won and set up the People's Republic of China on the mainland, and the US-backed nationalists set up shop in Taiwan, which became the Republic of China. Taiwan was once an authoritarian state, but during the 80s and 90s, it transitioned into a democracy and heavily invested into education and technology, becoming one of the most important producers of microchips. And it has a standard of living far outpacing that of mainland China, even with mainland China's massive economic growth. Taiwan has very limited political recognition, however, due to the People's Republic of China's concerns at the UN, but nonetheless, it is still a very close ally of the US and other Pacific democracies. Taiwan's waterways also block off the Chinese Communist Party from the open ocean to an extent. Their production of microchips makes them a massive asset, and their liberal democratic system is a threat to China's Communist Party's authoritarian government, which has not produced such impressive results pound for pound, kilo for kilo. Now, you may not have noticed, but China is, contrary to popular belief, no longer the largest country by population. That honor, if you could call it that, actually goes to India. India has the largest population on the planet and is the largest democracy, with friendly yet non-aligned relations with the West, as well as friendly yet non-aligned relations with Russia. But it has very poor relations with China and Pakistan. Now, India got its independence from the British Empire peacefully and developed into the world's largest democracy, even before it was the largest country by population. However, the aftermath of its independence was far from peaceful. The partition of India between the majority Hindu India and the majority Muslim Pakistan, along with Bangladesh, which would later break off, would lead to massive riots, chaos, and displacement. To this day, India and Pakistan both are nuclear-armed countries and have deep-seated hostility towards each other, including border disputes, which China has gladly taken advantage of, most notably in the region of Kashmir. China is forging stronger relations with Pakistan, including a plan for a corridor of trade through Pakistan at the detriment of India. China has also forged strong trade ties with many of India's neighbors like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. Now, the greatest threats here are nuclear weapons. Pakistan allows for a nuclear first strike, while India doesn't. This is because India, by conventional military standards, is far more powerful, by nearly every metric, despite being surrounded by unfriendly neighbors. India might want to work on its statecraft and strategy, as it has a gravitational pull that could perhaps tilt many of these surrounding countries, aside from Pakistan, into its orbit of influence. After all, it is the most economically, technologically, and militarily powerful nation in the subcontinent, more so than Pakistan. On top of that, the borders between India and Pakistan, for that matter, tend to be composed of deserts and very high mountains, along with swamps that kind of act as buffers between these nations. Now, India, by conventional military standards, is far more powerful than Pakistan by virtually every metric as previously mentioned. Now, as far as China is concerned with India, there actually have been very few military conflicts. The Himalayan mountains just are an impenetrable barrier that makes it very difficult to fight outside of a handful of small skirmishes in the past. However, given that China controls Tibet and the glaciers on it, the Chinese can build dams that not only provide China with hydroelectric power, but also cut off India's water supply. In order to make up for this unfriendly neighborhood, India has forged friendly, yet not alliances with the relations of outside powers. It is the largest buyer of Russian weapons, which is part of the reason why it has not condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Despite this, is also friendly with Western countries, as it holds a lot of major business and technological ties, along with a very successful diaspora in many Western nations, most notably the United States. In countries like the UK and Canada, they're actually a considerable voting bloc. Now, given the track record of Russian weapons in Ukraine, I predict that India will probably slowly but steadily start for Western weapons due to the effectiveness that we've seen in Ukraine, or more accurately, lack of effectiveness. However, this will probably take decades to make any sort of significant transition, and I don't think India is moving closer to the West anytime soon. Overall, India will probably maintain its friendly relationship with both the West and Russia in order to avoid any sort of significant quagmire between the two powers and stay strong against Pakistan and China. Now, let's move on to the Middle East, which is unsurprisingly the most complex. This region has the worst borders and the weirdest set of shifting alliances, as well as a ton of oil and natural gas. The two main players in this region are Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran would almost certainly take the side of Russia and China, and many of Iran's proxy groups such as the Houthis would also side with them. On the other side, you'd also have Saudi Arabia, a theocratic monarchy aligned with the West alongside Gulf state allies like the UAE, Bahrain, as well as, most controversially, Israel. In spite of the Gaza conflict, Israel still has official relations with the UAE, Bahrain, and undercover relations with Saudi Arabia. These countries have by and large been working under the cover to counter Iran despite their disagreements over the Palestinian question. And many have engaged in a trade of hydrocarbon resources from the Gulf in exchange for access to technology from Israel. Again, this is an incredibly touchy and complex relationship, and it is subject to change more than any other part of the video. So what I'm saying now could go totally wrong 2 months from now. Anyway, there is one black sheep within the Gulf family, and that is Qatar. Qatar, or Qatar if you want to call it that, is a bit of let's just say, outlier, a wild card. It has close relations to Turkey and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, a group that rivals the Egyptian military-led government. But it also has murky relations with Saudi Arabia. It has this sort of weird web of alliances and close political and cultural ties to other Gulf powers, even though it kind of runs its own show. On top of that, it is the center of Al Jazeera, the most influential Arabic-speaking news channel, meaning that Qatar has a great deal of soft power and a great deal of influence when it comes to shaping political thought throughout the Arabic-speaking world. Qatar in particular is known for being more hostile to Israel than, say, other Gulf nations, but nonetheless, they're also a US ally. Another US ally is Egypt, which is also aligned with Saudi Arabia, and has formal diplomatic relations with Israel. On the other hand, Iraq would probably side with Iran due to the large Shiite plurality. Lebanon and Yemen, however, would be split by various factions. Oman would probably remain neutral given the fact that it's the only country in the region that just kind of doesn't hate anybody else. Good for you, Oman. You managed to exist in the Middle East and not be hated by anybody. Good for you. It's also worth noting they have a really cool beach with sea turtles. I went there. Anyway, Oman also holds an exclave known as Musandam, which is great for scuba diving and also is a critical geopolitical flashpoint. This strait is where countless oil tankers travel through, and whether or not Oman can keep the peace here is a matter of debate, and we'll have to see whether it can stay neutral. Overall, it still tends to prefer Saudi Arabia. Now, moving on from the desert and the hottest part of the globe to one of the coldest, the Arctic. This area could be home to combat during the summertime, given the open waterways for shipping, as well as the mineral and hydrocarbon resources. Russia has the largest capabilities in the region, while the US allies like Canada, Denmark, and Norway have been frustrated with the US's lack of interest in the area. Further down the line, World War III breaks out, if it does break out, the more important the Arctic would be, given that climate change is melting the polar ice caps at a more rapid pace. I doubt there would be any polar bear uprising, though. Now, I do want to acknowledge that there are a few other regions like Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa worth mentioning, but I don't think that they would feature very prominently in any global conflict. And honestly, like, if you're from one of these places, you really just want to step this one out. But hey, who knows? Bolivia, which is backed up by China, could fight Chile, which is backed up by the Western powers. But who knows if that will really be the case, and chances are it's not. But hey, there's a lot of lithium for batteries, so we'll have to wait and see. If there were to be a starting point of the war, it would probably be placed on Taiwan. Taiwan, being the main manufacturer of microchips, makes it a critical player in the technological innovations of the world economy as a whole. While the US and Germany have set up their own manufacturing plants, it will take a long time before they can make up Taiwan being cut off. This, along with maritime trade routes, would be the primary reason why the US, along with many of its Pacific allies like Japan and Australia, could intervene to defend Taiwan. Granted, much of the innovation behind these chips in Taiwan actually comes from the United States. Taiwan, by and large, handles the complex manufacturing. So whether or not the US and its allies would intervene at the end of the day is still up for debate. For the sake of this video scenario, I'm just going to assume that they do, even though I'm honestly split 50-50. Such a war involving the two largest economic powers would rupture supply chains around the world with devastating consequences for virtually everybody. However, it may hurt China more, as China is not as self-sufficient. After all, China has a very heavily based export trade economy. The US is a little bit more self-contained. The US, along with its allies like Japan and Australia, have more advanced military technology than China, but China would have the geographic advantage of proximity, as the US is far away. China, on the other hand, has a massive population which gives it an advantage. Now, the Taiwanese military is formidable on its own, but it's unlikely to manage defending itself on its own without direct help. Perhaps it could muster the morale of what we've seen in Ukraine at the beginning of the war, plus the gods of Olympus and the Avengers combined, but otherwise, I'm not sure how tough they would be able to manage. The invasion would be amphibious, which would make it far more difficult for China than it is for Russia. After all, Ukraine is flat land, and it's a dry invasion. An amphibious invasion by China would be incredibly tough, but with overwhelming numbers of Chinese soldiers and a Chinese Communist Party that doesn't really care about how many of the soldiers die, then they could be able to pull it off at great costs. Opposition to the war in China would be crushed, and US allies may choose a different route of cutting off trade relations. Australia, with its nuclear submarines, would cut off Chinese trade through the Strait of Malacca. Various Southeast Asian nations, angered by China building up man-made islands in the South China Sea like the Philippines, Malaysia, and even Vietnam, would enter the side on the side of Taiwan. Vietnam, surprisingly enough, is fairly pro-US today. Given its young demographics, they don't really remember the US napalm bombing them, but rather are far more concerned with the long track record of China subjugating and invading Vietnam a number of times. This could lead to border clashes, which results in a ground invasion by either side, or perhaps a number of maritime skirmishes. Vietnam would probably be more of a co-belligerent rather than a US ally, like, say, the Philippines, which is deeply connected with the United States, or Australia. Now, the Australians could cut off maritime trade routes for the Chinese, and this would lead the Chinese to focus more on terrestrial trade routes with their Belt and Road Initiative. On the other hand, Australia's biggest trading partner is China, and China is reliant on Chinese mining. Australia's main defense partner is the US, and by and large this is due to ideological purposes, linguistic similarities, and cultural ties. Now, as far as the Korean Peninsula is concerned, I believe that they would probably want to sit this one out, and would be heavily pressured by both the US and China to not engage in a military conflict. This is pretty much due to the fear of nuclear weapons. Seoul is at artillery distance of North Korea, and North Korea has a massive army, but South Korea is far more competent and well equipped. North Korea is such a black box that I can't really be certain of much of anything. Now, South Korea and Japan are under the nuclear umbrella of the United States, so North Koreans should think twice. But let's keep it real. Do the North Korean nukes even work? I really don't know. Some reports say that they could hit South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, and perhaps even the US territory of Guam, maybe even Hawaii and Alaska. If they could hit Seattle or Portland, the US would probably pressure the peninsula heavily to stand still. China is also deeply worried about the potential of a massive refugee crisis as North Koreans could flood into China. Overall, I think this would make it just unlikely that there would be any sort of significant conflict in this region. However, it would be extraordinarily tense. Another problem for the US is that while it has allies like South Korea and Japan, some of them don't necessarily get along with each other. South Koreans, in certain circumstances, actually prefer China compared to Japan. A lot of this has to do with Japan's downplaying of war crimes against Koreans during World War II. Both China and South Korea in particular have some shared trauma in regards to Japanese war crimes. This is part of the reason why there's no NATO equivalent in the Pacific. China's allies in the Pacific would include Russia first and foremost, but Russia just has one major port in the Pacific, and by and large would be more focused in Eastern Europe. Furthermore, their Siberian port freezes during the wintertime. Other Chinese allies like Cambodia, Myanmar, and the Solomon Islands are pretty weak. The main wild card would be Indonesia, which could tip the balance either way, and being a deciding factor in this theater of war. With one of the largest populations on the planet and control over countless maritime seaways, Indonesia's decisions could again tip the scales in one direction or the other. Indonesia's relationship with both the US and China have varied from friendly to tense throughout the decades. There is also a scenario in which they stay neutral and play each side to their own benefit. This may lead to a stalemate in the region, in which China takes over Taiwan with fierce resistance and many losses, but retracts from much of the South China Sea and pestering many other nearby nations. Meanwhile, the US allies in Europe would probably be fairly indifferent to the conflict in the Pacific outside of some economic ramifications. Some countries like France would steer away from engaging in the Pacific unless China directly threatens its Pacific island territories. The UK would be the outlier, using its navy to supplement the American, Australian, and Japanese operations in the Pacific. Now, speaking of Europe, let's move on to this theater. This, more than any other theater, had me change my perspective due to the events over the past few years. Had I made this video 4 years ago, I would have predicted that Russia would have used China invading Taiwan as a way to invade Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova or possibly even the Baltic states. However, as of early 2022, we all know that Russia invaded Ukraine. For the context, many Eastern European countries were once part of the same state as Russia under the Soviet Union, and before that the Russian Empire. This has been a great source of tension for nations like Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and the Baltic states, which were all once Soviet states, while Poland, Czechoslovakia, now Czechia and Slovakia, East Germany, and other nations like Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania were members of the Warsaw Pact, which was a defense pact against NATO. Due to widespread oppression of various people groups under the Russian boot, as well as the autocratic governments and relative lack of prosperity compared to Western Europe, many of these states eventually broke off after the Soviet Union collapsed, and would join the European Union and NATO. There's a misconception stating that the US and Europe forced these countries to join NATO, but this is not true. These nations have parliaments and referendums that would vote on joining NATO. Poland even warned the US that it would create nuclear weapons or at the very least start the program if it wasn't allowed to join NATO. Hungary, the most pro-Russia NATO member, voted to join NATO with 85% of the referendum. The NATO entry of Ukraine and Georgia was stuck in the mud as of 2008. Since then, Russia has basically occupied 2 regions of Georgia, as well as occupying Crimea in 2014, along with a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Oh yeah, and Russia is also occupying a region of Moldova called Transnistria, a European country that almost nobody talks about. Russia started its full-scale invasion of Ukraine largely due to Putin's imperious dreams of recreating a modern Russian empire and removing a regime that no longer was kissing his ass. Most believed that Russia would be able to take over the country in a matter of weeks. However, this did not happen, and over the course of 2 years plus, it still hasn't happened. It's actually 3 years now, wow. The war still rages on at the immense cost of lives, money, and the humiliation of Putin and many of those who defend him. Depending on how badly the war goes on for Russia, will be a pathway for additional incursions into other nations. Under this scenario, I will predict that Russia manages to keep hold of Crimea as well as a small segment of eastern Ukraine under a very tense ceasefire. This would provide as close to a soft landing for Putin as he could possibly have at this point. Again, this is up for debate. Remember that ceasefires are not peace treaties, and they could break out into violence when tensions flare. Perhaps emboldened by Ukraine's partial concessions, a Europe that hasn't fully gained military independence from the United States, and the US being distracted with China and Taiwan, Russia could take over the rest of Moldova, which is very weak and borders Ukraine to the west, further threatening the country of Georgia as well. Russia might be able to get its allies in its own collective defense alliance, CSTO, to join the fight. This includes numerous Central Asian nations as well as Belarus. However, these nations are very weak, fairly isolated, and given the fact that Russia did not come to defend one of the members, Armenia, from being invaded by a non-member Azerbaijan, it's unlikely that these countries would be willing to step in to help Russia. Belarus's alliance with Russia, after all, is pretty much tied to Lukashenko's relationship with Putin as well as Steven Seagal. So if one of them croaks, the countries could move in the opposite directions, making Russia even more isolated. Tensions could get extremely ugly in the Balkans as well, as, the Balkans just always get really ugly. The nation of Serbia is currently neutral, however, there are factions within Serbia as well as ethnic Serbs in Bosnia and Kosovo that are very pro-Russia. Some even want to create a greater Serbian ethno-state to take up more land for Serbia. However, this attempt worked out very poorly in the 90s. Both attempts by Serbian nationalists had been crushed by NATO previously, and Russia just kind of took the sidelines. This might also propel all non-Serb ethnic groups in the region to side against Serbia and against Russia. For this reason, Serbia would probably want to sit this one out. However, if the invasions are successful, Putin along with his ally Belarus could invade the Baltic states, which unlike other countries is occupied, are NATO members, triggering NATO Article 5 for self-defense. These Baltic states are pretty small, weak, and blocked off from the rest of NATO, save for a tiny gap to Poland. Lithuania borders both Belarus and a Russian exclave, and Latvia and Estonia share a fairly sized border between them and Russia. The two bigger players in the region would be Poland and Finland, who would spearhead the defense of the Baltic states. It's worth pointing out that Finland is close to Russian territory in which Russian nukes are located, but this would be extremely risky. The Baltic states, Poland, and the Scandinavian countries and the UK would choke off Russia from the Baltic Sea. On the other hand, Turkey, Romania, and Bulgaria, among others, would cut off Russia from much of the Black Sea. And this would all be before some of NATO's most powerful members, like France, Germany, and Italy, come into play. Whether or not the United States will come into play depends really on whether or not the president is Trump or someone else. Unless there is a very rapid and very efficient set of structural changes in Russia's military and logistical command and doctrine, there is a very slim chance that Russia could win. For this reason, Russia would probably threaten nuclear war in order to scare NATO or any remaining alliance from intervening. However, Russia, the US, France, and the UK all have nukes, so they probably wouldn't want to use them as this would result in everyone losing. At the end of the day, it's more about posturing rather than doing. NATO and Western nations in general don't have any incentive to use nuclear weapons since their conventional military structure is much stronger than that of Russia's. Nuclear weapons, or at the very least the posturing of nuclear weapons, tends to favor the weaker side, as conventional war would be a win for the West and a lose for Russia, but nuclear war would be a lose-lose scenario. You might as well posture about the lose-lose scenario if you're Russia, rather than engage in the lose-win scenario if you're Russia by conventional means. Now, under this scenario, most NATO countries or most Western-aligned nations would probably not want to risk the world for Latvia. Like, sorry Latvia, you're important, but you're not that important. This might lead to an abandonment of the NATO alliance system. Certain factions of France and Germany that are skeptical of hostile towards Russia might not want to join the war, and if there is a Trump or Trump-like administration in the United States, they might just leave Europe to its own affairs. However, most Eastern European nations, save for Hungary, would probably step in to help the Baltic states defend their land. The Ukrainians could use it as an opportunity to take back land that Russia stole from them. Under this scenario, the US and Anglophone countries, if there's a democratic administration, might not be too afraid to head to a direct war, but it would fuel immense sums of military equipment to various European nations. The war could drag on if the Western powers don't engage directly with Russian forces. One temporary solution would be a ceasefire, in which Russia takes Estonia and parts of the Baltic states and Georgia, but fails to make too many gains in Ukraine, let alone Poland. Western European nations and the United States could also lose interest in fighting Russia if there are election gains for right-wing populists who by and large tend to be isolationists, or people on the far left who tend to be non-interventionist and more sympathetic to Russia. That would cut off support for Eastern European countries, allowing Russia to make more gains. If no gains are made on the Russian side though, then Putin could be overthrown by another autocrat without imperialistic ambitions, and by and large wouldn't have to deal with the personal humiliation of ending the war. However, given how much of a black box the Kremlin is, we really don't know whether or not this is likely to come to fruition. Segments of Russia with large ethnic minorities which have disproportionately died during this conflict would demand independence or at the very least some form of sovereignty, or perhaps more autonomy as the body bags come piling up. And this could result in mass protests in Russia at a certain point. The casualty rate in Ukraine has been pretty devastating for Russia. Much of this will also depend on the price of oil and gas, which would probably skyrocket, and the cost of hydrocarbon resources would help Russia in the short run. But as we saw during the first winter of the Ukraine war, it might not be enough to help them succeed. Furthermore, Taiwan was basically setting up sanctions in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine to Russia in regards to microchips. This essentially blocks off Russia from further technological development in IT. On top of this reality could forge stronger ties between the conflict in Europe and the Pacific. Putin might just be better off keeping what he's already taken, and perhaps unionizing with Belarus and meddling in the affairs of Central Asian countries that at this point are closer to China. Any gains would be made at the massive cost of lives and money. Russia may, however, fare better in another theater of war: the Arctic, as their navy has been shown to be well equipped for the region, with a lot of icebreakers, and by and large, Russia is more interested in the Arctic than the United States. They might also make use of climate change in order to take over islands in the North Sea and perhaps even parts of Greenland. They could threaten Canada's Arctic territories and use their naval ships to traverse the Northwest Passage from June to September when the weather is warmer and there's less ice. Overall, I predict that Russia would probably fare far more poorly in this conflict overall than China would. Part of this is due to China being a far larger country in terms of populations, with generally speaking more competent and rational leadership. But you never know. China would probably be the dominant figure of this alliance, and Russia would be the lesser partner despite Russia's wishes. Another advantage China would have is that its adversaries in the Pacific, unlike Russia's adversaries in Europe, are not members of a multilateral alliance of over 30 countries. By and large, its Pacific adversaries don't necessarily get along with each other in the same way that Europeans do. Now, unlike the NATO alliance system in Europe, which is multilateral, the US alliance in the Pacific is a hub and spoke system, in which the United States is the hub, while its allies, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand, are spokes. Many of these spokes, while being allies of the United States, and by and large not being particularly friendly to China, by and large are not necessarily allied with each other. The most notable example of this is the relationship between South Korea and Japan, which tends to be quite complex. On top of that, China's trade relationships are vast, and much of their relations are terrestrial. So while the US's Blue Water Navy and those of its allies could cut off China to Southeast Asia and the Americas, its closest trading partners would still have direct links, albeit over vast land distances. Of those nations that do have strong economic and ever-growing political and military ties to China would be on the Indian subcontinent, namely India's main rival, Pakistan. Now, India is the founder of the non-aligned movement, a movement and organization of developing countries that threw off the yoke of European colonialism and tried their best to stay neutral throughout the Cold War. However, many of these neutral countries did lean towards one side or the other. During the Cold War, India slightly leaned towards the Soviet Union, as many Indians liked the socialist style of government, and were not too keen on the US's special relationship with its former colonizer and subjugator Britain. As a result, India was never an ally or enemy of either side, but they were still a major arms buyer of the Soviet Union and later Russia. Now, Pakistan on the other side, being a Muslim-majority country, was not too fond of atheist communists, and by and large preferred the United States. However, in more recent decades, this dynamic has been changing. After the attacks on the Twin Towers, India and the US have been forging stronger partnerships due to their shared struggle with Islamic extremism, among other factors. On the other hand, the US's relationship with Pakistan has oftentimes been frosty. Relations with the US and India have continued to improve. Indian Americans make up America's richest ancestral group, and both countries are IT giants. The US is the world's largest democracy in terms of power, and India is the largest in terms of population. This has not resulted in an alliance, but rather fairly friendly relations. On top of that, the rise of China has scared India, which has resulted in the Quad, composed of India, the US, Japan, and Australia, four countries which seek to limit China's rise. In other words, India maintains friendly relations with both the West and Russia, but on the other hand has a great deal of disdain for China and Pakistan. I doubt India's relationship with Russia would completely sour. After all, it's quite reliant on Russia for arms. India is also reliant on Russian natural gas, which it has been getting at fairly cheap prices since the Ukraine war started. Now, India could slowly transition into Western arms, seeing the Russian lackluster performance. However, again, this transition could take decades. Regardless of this, India still maintains friendly relations with much of the outside world, and probably would not be too interested in mounting any sort of core alliance. Its main rival, after all, is Pakistan, as stated before. Both India and Pakistan were part of the British Raj, but the split during independence resulted in a secular, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious, yet mostly Hindu India, and on the other side, Islamic Pakistan. The partition resulted in major displacement, missing people, and civil unrest, a scar that still exists to this day. They have been at loggerheads for pretty much 3/4 of a century, and have been involved in brief spats of violence, which becomes all the more dangerous now that they have nuclear weapons. India maintains that it will not be the first to initiate a nuclear strike, but will retaliate with nuclear weapons if deterrence fails. Pakistan does have a nuclear strike policy since its military, economy, and civil structure is weaker than that of India's in virtually every possible way. Pakistan also is in many ways a massive powder keg, probably the biggest in the world. It struggles with corruption, instability, and Islamic terrorist groups that oftentimes attack the state but also are sometimes funded by the state. By conventional military use, the Pakistani army would probably fail to take on India, and so nuclear weapons could become the equalizer. Pakistan historically has looser ties with the West, but as a result of Pakistan's support for Islamist groups and the killing of Pakistani civilians by American drone strikes, this has led to a great deal of anti-Western sentiment among the country's population, even though much of the military brass is still closely aligned with the West. India and Pakistan also have a number of border disputes, particularly in the northern alpine region of Kashmir. This region borders China, which provides a corridor to push trade and military relations between China and its ally Pakistan. Furthermore, China has also forged close economic ties with India's neighbors like Sri Lanka and Nepal, and Bangladesh by and large gets along with both India and China, as India helped to gain its independence from Pakistan, and China has many economic ties, which could result in the country being neutral, sandwiched between India and Chinese allies like Myanmar. I predict that the Indian subcontinent theater would probably be one of co-belligerents rather than allies. The West may help India fight Pakistan and more importantly China, but India would most likely be on its own and would not aid the West in fighting Russia, but perhaps would provide some aid in fighting China in the Pacific indirectly. Direct conflict between India and China would probably not be particularly common though, due to the Himalayan mountains. Chinese dams in Tibet could also cut off India's water supply, or at least part of it. However, it could also cut off part of Pakistan's water supply, and this could be a gigantic mess. On top of that, India could fund separatist groups in Tibet. China would prefer to have Pakistan do all the heavy lifting in this region due to the geographic barriers and the logistical nightmare. On top of that, China would probably be far more interested in dealing with the Pacific rather than, say, the Indian subcontinent. On top of that, Pakistan could foster resentment in India's large Muslim population in wealthy regions like the Gujarat province. However, I still think India would push back any Pakistani advance at immense cost of lives, given how densely populated certain regions like Punjab are. If one region is likely to result in the use of nukes, it is this one though. At the end of the day, it might as well just become a stalemate, or a breakup of Pakistan due to its own sectarian divisions, leading the country to crumble into various pieces. This might lead to other powers scrambling to make sure that those nukes don't make it into the hands of terrorist groups, which would be terrible for everyone involved, including the Pakistani elites. Anyway, moving on to a less depressing subject. Actually, I take that back, an equally depressing subject, if not a more depressing subject. The war in the Middle East. You thought it was going to get better. No, it doesn't. Now, this is the most complex of all theaters. There are tangling systems of alliances and rivalries that oftentimes shift and are subject to change, so probably everything I'm going to say is going to be wrong. Also, given the fact that this region has a lot of oil and gas, it is very strategically important. Unless breakthroughs in green technology or fusion energy takes pace faster than expected, this is going to be a recurring issue. However, I don't want to make the mistake of reducing the entire region's geopolitics to oil and gas. It's far more complicated than that. I also don't want to make this video 9 hours long, so I'm going to break it down in simplistic terms. The US allies are Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and some of the Gulf states like the UAE and Kuwait. The US is also allied with Turkey and Qatar, both of which have frosty relations with Saudi Arabia and have some reservations about their alliance with the West, but by and large don't really like Iran either. Again, this is all subject to change. The US diplomats have played a key role in stopping the Saudis from invading Qatar. The US is also allied with the Kurds of northern Iraq and Syria, even though many of the Kurds do not like Turkey, which is also a US ally. Yeah, it's getting really confusing, isn't it? On top of that, we have Iran, which used to back Syria before the Syrians, backed up by Turkey, removed the pro-Iranian and pro-Russian Bashar al-Assad regime. There also were a number of Iranian proxies, such as the Palestinian group Hamas, which is also backed up by Qatar, but they've lost a great deal of their power. Not going to get into that shit show in detail. There's also Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, which is a Shiite faction, but they also have had their leadership decapitated and by and large are quite unpopular among the Lebanese populace who aren't Shiites. The one remaining major Iranian proxy are the Houthis in Yemen, but even they're fairly independent. On top of that, they have very, very bad relations with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. Remember that Saudi Arabia is Sunni, and by and large is the majority of the Sunni Muslim world, with some exceptions, whereas Iran is kind of like the leader of the Shiite world. Now, this is not to say that all Sunnis back Saudi Arabia and all Shiites back Iran. It's far more complicated than that, but generally speaking, that tends to be the main trend. Now, because you thought it was going to get any better, I have to mention Israel. While having a long history of bad relations with the Arabs, it does have formal diplomatic relations with Egypt and Jordan, and more recently the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Now, I'm not going to dwell too much on Israel because there is already a gigantic amount of information about it. I think it also takes a little bit too much attention compared to its relative importance, and on top of that, the discourse around Israel and Palestine tends to attract a tremendous amount of stupidity and a lack of nuance. I'm going to switch to the Persian Gulf, which is more important in my opinion. This would be the main theater of this region along the Strait of Hormuz, where a large chunk of the oil tankers go through. This peninsula borders the exclave of Oman, which would probably still be neutral, given that Oman again is the only country in the region that gets along with everybody and could be a mediator. But who knows, maybe Saudi Arabia could pull the Omanis to their side. After all, the Iranians are on the other side, and they do not like Arabs by and large. Most of Saudi's oil is in the Shiite minority region, which scares Saudi royalty due to its potential Iranian influence. A lot of the oil and gas that's found on the border between Iraq and Iran, on the other hand, also has a lot of Arabs, which scares the elites of Iran. Given its large Shiite population in Iraq, it's likely that Iraq would by and large choose Iran, but it also has a large Sunni population which by and large would prefer Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia would also have close ties to the government of Bahrain, which is an island nation run by Sunnis but is majority Shiite. This could make it a powder keg. Now, the aforementioned Kurds are another major ethnic group in this region, located at the crossroads of Turkey, Iran, and Syria. The country most well known for clashing with them is Turkey, a country that is allied with the US, as Turkey is a NATO ally. However, Turkey also maintains a fairly independent foreign policy and doesn't have any problems taking issues with US policy. Who knows, maybe the Kurds take advantage of the chaos for the sake of the formation of their own state. They are a formidable military force, but whether or not they could create an administration structure of one state is another matter. Now, it's also worth keeping in mind that Israel has good relations with the Kurds and also has undercover allies with Saudi Arabia, primarily to oppose Iran. This warming of relations under the table, in spite of deep, tense, hostile relations over the Palestinian issue, may come to fruition if a war breaks out between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It may lead to Iran taking on the mantle as the champion of the Palestinian cause, and many believe that the attacks on October 7th were in many ways Hamas's/Iran's veiled message to Saudi Arabia, telling them not to form diplomatic relations with the Jewish state. Overall, nearly all of Iran's proxies have been severely weakened. The Bashar al-Assad regime has been overthrown, Hamas has been nearly destroyed, and Hezbollah has been decimated. Israel also currently occupies the Syrian territory of the Golan Heights, giving them a strategic advantage given the higher elevation. Any conflict that would break out in the Middle East would almost certainly lead to hostilities within the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, two Palestinian territories that are being currently occupied, and given Israel's limited strategic depth, this could be a serious issue. Israel's other neighbors, Egypt and Jordan, are both US allies and Saudi allies, but they would probably try not to intervene as Israel is deeply unpopular in their countries. However, the governments by and large hate Iran and like Saudi Arabia, so they could help Saudi Arabia fight Iran and its proxies. Israel, Iran, and Turkey would probably end up becoming the three most powerful militaries on the scene. Whether or not Saudi Arabia would prove to be a powerful military is a matter up for much debate. While they are extremely well funded and have a great deal of American weapons, whether or not they could execute them into a powerful military force against Iran is highly debatable. Egypt, on the other hand, would have a difficult tightrope to walk. On one hand, it doesn't like Israel, but on the other hand, it doesn't like many of the Iranian-backed proxies in the Palestinian territories. They also support Saudi Arabia, but would they really want to enter a war with Iran? Probably not. Now, Egypt might also use this opportunity and all the chaos to attack Ethiopia's Nile Dam, while the rest of the world is too distracted with other theaters of war to pay attention to the African continent. Ethiopia is planning on building a dam that could devastate Egypt's lifeline, the Nile River. The Ethiopians are doing this for the sake of producing their own power. But this could plunge Egypt into chaos, a country that already has to deal with water and food scarcity, as well as a great deal of corruption. Egypt could use this opportunity to strike the dam, destroying it with its air force, which might pull Ethiopia and Sudan into a conflict. Well, or more accurately, further conflict, since they're already embroiled in conflicts. Given that Egypt is an American ally and Ethiopia is a Chinese ally, both major powers would pick sides diplomatically and provide each one with aid respectively, but would almost certainly not intervene directly. On top of that, the US, UK, and other Western powers would probably arm the Suez Canal to the teeth to make sure that supplies move in and out of that region and are cut off from Russia and China. Whether or not the Egyptians agree to this is another matter. Western nations would also aid Saudi Arabia in the Persian Gulf to make sure that Iran doesn't control the waterways, even if Iran maintains an advantage against the Arabs on land. Now, certain areas of Yemen, Iraq, and to a lesser extent Syria and Lebanon might end up just devolving into complete failed states if they're not already considered to be complete failed states. After all, this region has some of the worst borders on the planet, drawn out by European colonists after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War II. These borders have no regard for ethnic, tribal, linguistic, ideological, religious, economic, geographic, or ecological boundaries. In spite of all the chaos, and bloodshed, perhaps the century-long borders that have been drawn so arbitrarily that may have caused so much of this strife to begin with may be reorganized into something more sensible, possibly giving the Kurds their own state, splitting Sunni and Shia populations to some degree, while at the same time forcing the ones that do have borders within the same contained nation state to just live together and get along. Maybe draw borders on natural barriers like mountain ranges, rivers, or swamps. Or hey, maybe we'll even see some liberal democracies function. After all, a large swath of Iran's population, by and large, are more moderate than the actual people in power. Damn. Let's move on to a less complex region, Latin America. Now, it would be unlikely that a region like Latin America or Sub-Saharan Africa would have any sort of major conflict that is tied to the global conflict. Russia and China have allies like Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, as well as to a lesser extent Bolivia in Latin America, but they probably would not play any significant role. What will play a major role is in space. Sure, space is demilitarized in theory, but would that really be the case if there was an event of a total war, especially given how important satellites are for military purposes? Another major sphere would be digital. This would be even more important, and perhaps possibly the most important theater of war, if you could call it that. The US, along with the European Union and its NATO allies and its Asian allies, would team up to take on Russia and China. China is digitally isolated due to censorship laws. However, it has made headway in Africa and Latin America through 5G networks, telecommunication infrastructure, and talented hackers. If China were to take on Taiwan, this could have devastating consequences for Western powers. After all, it's Taiwan's microchips that make the modern world. Given how much of the innovation comes from the US, though, the US and Germany have by and large started the production of their own microchips. This could soften the blow, but it would probably take decades for these manufacturing industries of microchips to really come into full fruition. Now, I want to make it clear, I doubt World War III would end like World War II, if it is to happen, with a total victory for one side. It's unlikely that you would ever see American and British troops capture Moscow, or Chinese troops occupying Tokyo, let alone Washington, D.C. Each theater would probably end on its own accord, with changes here and there, some victories for one side or the other. Nuclear weapons held by all the major powers make a total victory of either side utterly impossible unless we all want to die. And I'm assuming that wouldn't be a victory, that just would be a lose-lose-lose-lose-lose situation. So, let's not do that. Keep in mind that the scenario that I'm laying out, predicting, probably will be wrong. In fact, I'd say that it's probably 95% likely to be wrong. But hey, maybe if it does happen, the borders of the Middle East will be redrawn. Eastern Europe will be more integrated with Western Europe, and possibly there are Russian territories that break up and become independent states. China might extend its power into the Pacific with some tense treaty with the non-Taiwanese allied neighbors. Who knows? Keep in mind that when World War II ended, it didn't lead to sunshine and rainbows, but rather the Cold War. So it's likely that a war would not solve most of these problems, but create new ones. Although who knows, World War II did solve some problems. It ended fascism, led to the creation of the UN, and the world has been relatively more peaceful since then. But I'm gonna hope that a World War III doesn't happen, and it stays the purview of just random weirdos on the internet like me making predictions about stuff that is almost certainly BS. Let's hope it stays that way. Thanks for watching.